The Delaware River, a waterway that starts from two small ponds and runs over 300 miles through New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. It cuts through forests, the Appalachian Trail, and numerous cities. The river has seen everything from the Lenape people fishing to George Washington's crossing, to cities and parks expanding, climate change, and pollution, and now, finally, a period of restoration and recreation. It's more than a waterway. For hundreds of years, the Delaware, along with its tributaries, has changed the geography, history, and people of the region, and this is its story. The East Branch starts in Grand Gorge, New York, right off of Route 30 in a small pond. The branch flows in a southwest direction, joining other rivers and streams, flowing through lakes, and then creating the Papacton Reservoir. The reservoir was created by flooding 4 towns and about half of the Delaware and Northern Railroad.
So one of the interesting parts of the Delaware River and the Delaware Basin story is the story of New York City saying, hey, we don't have enough water and we want to take some of that water that flows down to New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, some of that Delaware Basin water, and do an interbasin transfer and take some of that water and pipe it over to New York City. And so that was a big fight. When New York City first proposed that, New Jersey was the first to say, wait a minute, no, that is, you cannot take that water in addition to the water that you're taking out of the Croton system and taking out of the Hudson system, and now take Delaware water. You can't do that. They took it to the Supreme Court, and there were 2 decisions, one decision in the 1930s and one decision in the 1950s, when the Supreme Court of the United States said, no, actually, and let me back up 1 second. When New Jersey first challenged it, then all of the states got involved. Pennsylvania joined the fight, Delaware joined the fight, New York State joined the fight, and so it's 5 different parties arguing in front of the Supreme Court. And essentially the Supreme Court said, look, let's find a balance here. New York City, yes, that water originates in the Catskills in New York State. You're allowed to take some of that water, but as part of the bargain, if you're going to build reservoirs and export that water out of the basin, now you are going to have to be part of the insurance policy to make sure there's enough water for New Jersey, there's enough water for Pennsylvania, there's enough water for Delaware, the state of Delaware, as well as for the full ecosystem. For oysters in Delaware Bay, there's enough water for sturgeon that live further up near Wilmington, near Camden, near Philadelphia. And there's going to be enough water for all the things living up in the freshwater portions of the estuary also. And so part of the deal there was that there were targets set. And one of those targets was at Montague, New Jersey, which the Supreme Court said, if you build these reservoirs and start to export 800 million gallons a day, it really is a lot of water, 800 million gallons a day export, now you actually have to set a target of 1,750 cubic feet per second, 1750 CFS at Montague, New Jersey, now has to be essentially the lowest flow that the Delaware River in that part sees. So what's funny about that is that is actually an elevated base flow, that by doing that, the Supreme Court basically said, we're not going to let the Delaware River get as dry as it used to get historically. We're going to elevate the base flow and keep the Delaware wetter than it was historically, partly so that there's enough water in there for the ecology and for human uses of that water further down.
Once the branches converge in Hancock, the Delaware truly comes alive. Heading south out of Hancock, you can see all the protected areas, the myriad of access points, boat launches, and campgrounds. As you continue to travel, you start to see how important the river is for life in the area. The Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area covers 70,000 acres, and beyond the immense beauty of its natural wonders, holds quantities of untold history. The Delaware River created the perfect area for our ancestors to settle. Resources were abundant in this fertile area, and their presence is still ever clear to this day. Old Mine Road is the oldest road in the nation, connecting Philadelphia and the Hudson River to the mines up north and winding through the park. Van Campen Inn is a stunning colonial building that offered shelter for a myriad of travelers along Old Mine Road and the surrounding area even during the French and Indian War. Millbrook Village is a preserved 1800s village, and Peters Valley hosts a great artist community. Today, the area seems like an untouched sliver of land and almost out of place. It has been protected to keep the history, natural wonders, and wildlife diversity alive. This is the area that is special to me and to a lot of people. The Delaware's influence is clear here. People in this area cross the Delaware every day, and their drinking water comes from its tributaries and floodplain. And it is the reason why there are so many parks. I grew up nestled in between the Water Gap Recreational Area and Sportswood State Park, every day going down into the river valleys and climbing atop the Appalachian Mountains.
Another issue that the Delaware Riverkeeper Network was involved in years ago was the Tux Island Dam project. The Tux Island Dam project was building an earthen dam just upriver of the Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area. And this was all going on when I was a teenager, and I wasn't paying attention to the news, this kind of news of the day, but it was there were a lot of amazing decisions were being made during that process. A lot of actions by the federal government, state governments, and the citizens and the residents that grew up along the river up there that we still feel very much today. The Tux Island Dam was defeated for a variety of different reasons. It was a huge success for the environmental community and the residents of that area, who back in that day didn't have computers where you could just do an email and send all your congressmen a quick letter, or get in touch with all your next door neighbors and the residents living downstream. It was all typewritten letters. It was driving, going door to door, talking to people after church, that sort of thing. So it made it, if you think of it in those regards, it was a huge successful environmental win. One of the unfortunate or fortunate, depending on how you look at it, results of that issue was the federal government bought up 64,000 acres, or a large number of acreage, up along where the Tux Island Dam would have had flooded out. And small villages are now under, would have been under the Delaware River. But the dam was defeated. But all that federally owned land now, land that was either purchased or taken by eminent domain, has taken that land and is now permanently protected for the benefit of all people in the Mid-Atlantic, for anywhere at all. In fact, the Delaware Water Gap is it's one of the most visited national recreation areas we have in the country. It's because it's located between Philadelphia and New York. It gets tens of thousands of people coming to the river every year for recreation. And as growing up in that area, I still have friends back in the Poconos who get angry, and very angry, where their family's farm was bought and taken by the federal government. And they get so angry about the national park running the park system as they know it and as we know it today. But they will even admit that if it were not for the National Recreation Area establishing that permanently protected area, that their backyard, their home, would look so much different than it does today. There would be hotels going all the way up Route 29 and over on Old Mine Road. There'd be golf courses, and there'd be light pollution from shopping centers and that. There'd be golf courses. So while it's a tremendous difficulty for them to think back of their family farms being taken through eminent domain for the Tux Island Dam, which never got built anyway, they can still drive up 209 and see Smithfield Beach, or the Hogback, or any other of these places that they remember fondly as growing up. They still remain unchanged, where today there would be the Hogback development or the Smithfield Beach golf course if it weren't for the National Recreation Area. And that protected area, those 64,000 acres of land, protected lands, now is protecting the Delaware River because it's preventing all the development that we talked about the expansion of development and the creep of development. Now that area is permanently protected as forests and ravines and swimming holes. It's a great and beautiful destination. It's one of the most beautiful sections of the Delaware River. One of the exciting things about our job here at the Delaware Riverkeeper Network is the opportunities we have to expose people of all ages to the Delaware River. Because there's an old saying that you'll protect what you know and you love. And so the more we can get everyone out on the river to experience it at different levels, the greater the voice and the more river keepers we're building and creating out there. One of the projects that the Delaware Riverkeeper Network has been doing for years that I'm most proud of is the United Nations International School Trip. And the international schools in Manhattan, and every year for the past 27 years, we've been taking their entire sophomore high school student body out on this shared adventure. They're going out, and where they normally walk across the bridge, walk across asphalt to get to the school, we're taking them out into the wilds of the Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area and giving them this shared experience, this shared adventure that they all have in common. All 127, this past year was 135 students. They pack their own bags, they paddle their canoes, they have to drag the canoes to the top of the embankment. They form a bucket brigade where they take hand over hand, they take the canoes up to the top of the embankment and secure them for the night, and then bring them back down, and they're sweating and they're singing and that, but they're experiencing with this hardship, they get to experience it in this beautiful section of the Delaware River. And it's very cool because these kids, as I said, are growing up in the city. And here they get to wake up to wading birds and bald eagles flying overhead. And you just know that you're planting a seed from talking to them. You just know you're planting the seed that this is an experience that they'll take with them for the rest of their lives. On the flip side of that, or on the other side of the continuum, down in Philadelphia and Camden City, we take kids also growing up in urban communities, but the waterways that they experience aren't these beautiful middle and upper Delaware reaches. We've taken kids out in Camden and in Philadelphia on urban waterways that they've walked across on bridges going back and forth to school and look down and seeing trash-strewn, polluted waterways. And these are waterways that the kids don't even think about. They just look at them and think that they're eyesores and they're just places where we dump our industrial waste. Well, when they get down in there and they see the great blue herons and even bald eagles, and they see fish jumping, they're blown away the fact that there's such wildlife diversity in their community. And you can just, from talking with them after the trip, you just get the realization that these kids are becoming river keepers themselves, because now they realize that their corner, their backyard has something to protect and has wildlife that they never realized would be there. So getting individuals out on the waterway is so critical. People that live and grew up in the Poconos or in North Jersey along these waterways, many times they don't realize how lucky they have it, and they don't realize this until years go by.
As you can see, I'm standing at one of the most iconic sites on the Delaware River. Right there is the Delaware Water Gap. It is an ancient glacial phenomenon, and the river millions and millions of years ago cut its way through the rock. This area, which is Northampton County, Pennsylvania over here, and Warren County, New Jersey over there, with Monroe County, Pennsylvania right up there. was the origination of the tourism industry for people who lived in New York City starting in the Victorian era back in the 1800s. They came here and there were boarding houses set up, and many of them escaped the heat of the summer by spending their summers here. So tourism, when it's done in being inclusive of the communities and the long-time traditional economic drivers, the jobs that have always supported life along the river, is also another form of conservation, protection, and preservation of the river, the watershed, and the communities nearby. They must coexist without polluting the watershed, without polluting the air. Because if we allow that to happen, then everything else that we have in this region goes away. So an example of how some things have changed with the agriculture industry is that we have more and more family farms who understand that to be competitive, they need to tie into the new market. And what is the new market? It is organically grown produce. So all along this corridor, we have small family farms, people who have always lived here, have always made their living and their lifestyle by farming the land, but they have switched from more invasive and harmful and toxic uses or farming technology to moving to organically grown. This is growing in popularity with the massive numbers of people who live in our region who want to eat organic for health reasons and who want to come here and buy from many pick your own farms, local farmers markets that are staffed and vendored by local produce, locally produced farms. And we have a growing, burgeoning microbrewery and distillery segment growing here. One reason is because the water here is clean and tasty, and they're not using much of it in their processing, and it helps produce clean, sometimes even completely organic wines and spirits. And so what does that do? Of course, again, then the restaurants grow up around that. We have farm-to-table events going on up and down this section of the Delaware River. So economically, the river has always been important. The river is always going to be important economically. And we take great pride in the fact that our travel program encourages people to spend their money responsibly at places that are small, locally owned, and have a commitment to sustainability of our historic and natural resources.
One of the projects that I've had the fortune of being part of is the removal of an antiquated dam only about a half-mile upstream from the Delaware River on the Pollenskill River, one of the extraordinary rivers in the state of New Jersey. A fantastic, very diverse, very biologically rich system. But there's a dam, an old hydropower dam, about a half-mile upstream from the Delaware River, and folks realized that that was antiquated, it wasn't generating very much hydropower, and was causing a lot of negative ecological impacts to the Pollenskill River itself and to all of the species that depend on it, particularly migratory fishes such as American shad, such as herring, blueback herring, and alewife, as well as migratory fish that aren't as sexy, but actually probably more ecologically important. The American eel, the big old slimy eels, look like they may be the most important migratory fish that we have in the Delaware River system. That they, unlike shad who come in, spawn, and then get back out before winter comes, American eels come into these systems, live there for between 10, 20, even 25 years if you're a really big female, and then move out. And as an omnivore and as an important predator, right, these eels play a really critical role in these ecosystem functions. And so we have a number of projects looking at that. And so what's so exciting about the Pollens kill is that here you have a really high hydropower dam only a half-mile upstream, and the Delaware has no dams downstream of that, right? So it's the longest, or is known as the longest free-flowing river east of the Mississippi. And so migratory fish, including shad and eels, are up and down the Delaware River, right to the mouth of the Pollens kill, and shad bump their noses up against that dam. And as a partnership between the state of New Jersey, the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, the Nature Conservancy, American Rivers, those are the three primary partners, as well as a bunch of groups like us at the Delaware Riverkeeper Network, the U.S. Geological Survey. A bunch of groups have been involved, the Academy of Natural Sciences, as well as others, looking at kind of scientifically what is going to happen when you remove that dam, what are conditions before that dam is removed, and what do things look like in the subsequent years. And so that dam is literally being removed now as we speak, 2018, as soon as, actually it's raining outside today, so they're not probably doing much work because they can't get into the river when things are really high, but they have actually notched the dam already in August of 2018, and so they are in the process of removing that dam, stabilizing some of the structures, some of the bridges upstream. And so within the next 6 months or 12 months, this is going to be a free-flowing river. So it's really exciting. Part of our role in this project has been working with the U.S. Geological Survey and other groups, looking at a unique group of aquatic organisms called freshwater mussels. They're these, or pearly mussels. They're a group of clams, of bivalves, in the family Unionidae that have these really amazing complex life histories, have a parasitic stage on fish in order to complete their life cycle. And so with one of those species in particular, the eastern elliptio, they are dependent on migratory fish, in particular the American eel, for their reproduction. And if you lose American eel, like you do with the big dam, then these freshwater mussels can no longer complete their life cycle, and you just get a bunch of old, ancient mussels in that system. So part of the uplift that we're expecting from this dam removal is we get eels as well as shad and other migratory fish moving back up the Mesconetcong River all the way up to Blairstown, which is where the next dam is. And we get American eels back in that system, that we can actually rejuvenate and reinvigorate the population of things like freshwater mussels, in addition to helping the water quality of the system, helping the overall ecology by this dam removal. So it's a really exciting project. There are expectations that we might be able to remove other dams, particularly the dam there near Blairstown, and kind of complete the restoration of the Pollens kill and get all of the species, both the species that are resident in the river and don't migrate, as well as some of these migratory fishes and the species that are dependent on those migratory fishes, back into this river, so we can get kind of a full thriving, and as the Nature Conservancy likes to say, you know, making good even better, making good even best for these rivers. So it's an exciting opportunity, and it's pretty neat that we got to be involved in this work, again, led by New Jersey DEP, American Rivers, and the Nature Conservancy.
Some of the bigger threats that are impacting the Delaware River watershed today are hydraulic fracking, or hydraulic fracking, looking for natural gas, using high pressure water and sand and chemicals to pump underground to create fissures underground when it releases this natural gas, naturally occurring gas that's diffuse underground as much as a mile underground, but then can bring that back up to the surface. And that's happening throughout throughout Pennsylvania and into New York, and it's threatening. It's threatening because there is Marcellus shale and deposits under the Delaware River watershed. So far, we've been successful at stopping that oil and gas exploration in the Delaware River watershed, but just in nearby watersheds on the Susquehanna, it's going like crazy. So that's a real potential threat. It's happening out in our rural counties, and it's changing those rural counties into industrial lands. It may look like just a concrete pad sitting off on a farmland, but underground there is a whole network of pipelines and wells that are filled with toxic chemicals that are pumped underground in order to bring that natural gas up to the surface. And then there are pipelines that take it from the well site to transfer stations all the way across the Delaware River watershed, either down to Philly or over to North Jersey, where it can be processed, and much of that natural gas is being exported overseas. So that's a huge threat to the Delaware River watershed. Another big threat, again, is just the continued expansion of residential and commercial homes. We call it development creep. It's slowly taking over and slowly changing rural communities into suburban communities. I live down near Philadelphia in South Jersey, where one town borders right up next to the other. That community, those communities just 70, 80 years ago were farmlands, and what we see now is throughout the Delaware River watershed, we're continuing to that creep, that continual expansion of development is going further and further up. So another issue that that the Delaware Riverkeeper Network had worked on, and we worked closely with the Delaware Water Gap National Recreation staff and planners, was the Susquehanna-Roseland transmission line project, which brought high-power tension lines from the Susquehanna River in middle of Pennsylvania, across Pennsylvania, across the Delaware River at Bushkill, into New Jersey. I think it's Sussex County, and down to Roseland, New Jersey, and it was an opportunity to work with the National Park Service staff, and what impressed me about it was they were while having to maintain balance and objectivity, so that they could stay engaged in this process of the power lines crossing the park area. You had the sense that they were feeling like they were fighting for their river, that it was a significant challenge, and they wanted to do it right. They wanted to make sure all the natural resources that were going to be impacted got calculated into this process. And it was several years that it went through. The National Park Service Bushkill office worked on this project. And while we didn't win the project, the Susquehanna-Roseland transmission line went in. Because of the fight that the communities and the environmental organizations like the Delaware Riverkeeper Network and the Park Service, the participation of the Park Service, we were able to get a significant settlement. And I believe that the power companies were originally offering $32 million to the parks because they knew there was going to be an environmental impact, damage to the natural resources, the Delaware River and the tributaries. The tributaries are the streams that flow in to the Delaware River. They knew there was going to be an impact to that waterways, to the wetlands and to the trees and the forests, but also to the visual impact of all the recreational users that come to the Water Gap for canoeing, for hiking, biking on the McDade Trail, leaf peeping in the fall, snowshoeing and cross-country skiing in the wintertime. They knew there would be an impact. They ended up settling for all those environmental impacts to closer to $64 million that the Department of Interior and the Delaware Water Gap National Recreation now have to improve their parks. And we know that they are working it's giving them the ability to take care of maintenance backlog in the park. They've bought and gotten conservation easements on privately owned land that now provide wildlife accesses from area state game lands and state parks now to the national recreation area. So it's expanded the park without actually having to buy more federal lands. So So it's done a lot of good things. And so it just, again, it was just seeing how the National Park Service staff stood up and worked hard to protect not only the Water Gap National Recreation Area, but the Delaware River, because all of that flows downstream. What we do upstream to protect the Delaware River protects the entire Delaware River.
One of the biggest water quality changes we see on the main stem of the Delaware River is right in Phillipsburg and Easton, where the Lehigh River comes and joins the Delaware River. And part of that is that there has been a long legacy of abuse of the Lehigh River going back, decades and decades. Some of it related to just a lot of people live in the Lehigh Valley. Part of it related to the heavy industry, Bethlehem Steel, that was there and the abuses that happened there. Going further upstream to the coal mining that happened in some of the headwaters of the Lehigh River, and the continuing acid mine drainage that comes out of there and kills aquatic organisms in the Lehigh Gorge. And then the Palmerton zinc mine, where whole hillsides were denuded of vegetation because of the toxicity of the smelting operations there. But all of that means that the Lehigh River is a cocktail of some toxic compounds, really heavy on nutrients. And so where the Delaware River, even though it's 3 times the size of the Lehigh, when it comes there into Phillipsburg and Easton, the Lehigh is so juiced with nutrients and other compounds that the water quality changes markedly. The nutrient concentration doubles in the Delaware River, and we start to see appreciable concentrations of toxic compounds such as arsenic because of the contribution from Lehigh. And we see that biologically. We see a 90% drop in freshwater mussels. So above the Lehigh confluence, you can find big, lush beds of dense freshwater mussels. As soon as you get in that confluence zone, there's a few mussels still on the New Jersey side where it's pure Delaware River water. But as that Lehigh River water blends in over the following 5 to 10 miles and you get mixing of the 2 rivers together, the populations of those freshwater mussels decline severely, approximately 80 to 90% decline, because of something that's coming in that Easton, Phillipsburg, and probably from the Lehigh River. We haven't isolated exactly what it is. But again, a severe change in the ecology of the Delaware River because of these very noticeable, very easy to measure changes in water quality because of the pollution and the legacy of human impacts in the Lehigh River. And so it's something that we need to chase. But there is hope. There are signs that those impacts are being reduced. Back in the 1960s, when they would take caged organisms, either caged fish or caged aquatic insects, and put them into different places to look at the environmental toxicity of different rivers. When you did that in the Lehigh River and you came back the next day, a lot of those organisms were dead. There were a couple of stations on the Lehigh River where not just a couple, but every single organism that they put into the Lehigh River when they came back the next day was dead. And so the Lehigh is a lot better now than it was 50 years ago, but we still have a lot of room for improvement. And one of the signs that things are improving is there's a really unique and amazing species of freshwater plant called Podostemum ceratophyllum. We just normally call it Podostemum. It has a couple of common names like threadfoot or riverweed, but it likes to grow almost like a moss in fast water areas, unique. There's only one species that grows like this in our region. But this species of aquatic plant is very sensitive, probably to some metal. Every time you get an acid mine drainage stream, almost anywhere in Pennsylvania, you will kill off the populations of Podostemum in that stream. It happens in the Lehigh River. It happens in one of the most amazing river systems in Pennsylvania, Big Pine Creek in the Grand Canyon of PA. Right at the downstream edge of that Grand Canyon is a small acid mine drainage stream that has mostly been recovered, but it still has enough residual AMD and probably some kind of metal that plant, Podostemum, is entirely eliminated from what is, again, one of the signature rivers in Pennsylvania, one of the cleanest warm water systems, Pine Creek, all the way down to its confluence. You will not see Podostemum. But this plant, Podostemum, when we were doing mussel surveys, we had an intern in 2013 who said, "Hey, Eric, I think I might have found this plant." He showed me the specimens. I went back out. And what was interesting is it's not up there near Easton Phillipsburg, where you still have some influence of the kind of clean Delaware River. It's all the way down near the tidal river. We found this in the city limits of Trenton, New Jersey, this one lingering population of Podostomum right on the banks of the New Jersey side of the river. And since 2013, we found a couple additional populations further upstream, one at Scudder's Falls Bridge, one up near Washington Crossing, and the Fife and Drum Rapids just upstream of Titusville and Washington Crossing. And what's amazing is that I was able to go back to some of the records at some of the scientific museums, like the Academy of Natural Sciences, and you leaf back through the collection records and you look for when this plant was found in the Delaware River. And it looks like the last time this plant was found in the Delaware River in those zones was about 150 years ago. The late 1800s was the last time there was a collection record from lower Bucks County up and through upper Bucks County, so below the Lehigh River for this. And so it's a pretty amazing story that this plant has survived. It has really good populations upstream of Easton and Phillipsburg, great populations, even a mile upstream from there, very, very lush growths. Certainly up through the Delaware Water Gap, all the way up through the upper Delaware along the New York-Pennsylvania border. Really strong populations, probably the strongest populations in this region of the country for Podostomum. But what was entirely eliminated there from the Lehigh River confluence now looks like it's making its way back, and it's making its way back going from downstream to upstream. As that water is cleansed or purified or whatever that chemical is that's dropping out, probably some kind of metal, it is making it suitable for this plant to actually get a foothold and start to recolonize the Delaware River. So a lot of work to be done around Easton and Phillipsburg, a lot of work to be done in the Lehigh Valley, continuing to clean up the Lehigh River for its own sake, right? For the people that recreate on the Lehigh River, for the people that love the Lehigh River, for the people that fish, but also because it's probably one of the biggest causes of water quality changes to the Delaware River itself also. So an interesting story and a neat endeavor for the next 50 years.
So the primary mission of the Marine Environmental Response Department here at Sector Delaware Bay is to respond to oil and chemical spills in the environment that may affect the environment or public safety. The U.S. Coast Guard here at Del Bay shares this zone with the EPA. The Coast Guard has primary authority for response in what's known as the coastal zone, which covers a swath of land all the way into the river system. The sector here at Del Bay gets about anywhere from 300 to 500 response calls a year. And this ranges from small sheens and oil spills all the way up to large chemical spills from refineries or factories. The Marine Environmental Response Department also takes care of projects and plans, in addition to having a liaison with Fish and Wildlife, Department of the Interior, NOAA, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. We also, within these plans, will pretty much take into all our stakeholders' accounts endangered species, environmentally sensitive areas, and how best to protect these species and endangered areas across the broader spectrum of our area of responsibility. When we're not responding and helping out with plans, we're also looking at conducting facility and vessel inspections with these facilities. Basically, anything that transfers oil or hazardous materials via water, such as an oil transfer facility or a container facility or something that basically produces commerce, we'll inspect those facilities to make sure they have an active facility response plan that should something happen at their facility, the impact to the waterways and to personal health is minimal for the public. With vessel inspections, a lot of people don't know that the Coast Guard boards pretty much every foreign commercial vessel. So these vessels you see on the Delaware River, at one point in its voyages here in the United States, has been vetted and boarded or examined by a Coast Guard what's called Port State Control Boarding Team. And then within those teams, we do a couple different things. One of them is to inspect whether the ship has functional pollution response gear on board, such as an oily water separator, to make sure they're abiding with their operations manuals and they're not basically polluting the environment, and also to ensure that the well-being, treatment of the crew, as well as making sure they're not bringing in invasive species, that their ballast water management is conducted properly, and should we find anything on that exam, we're allowed to take action on it. Now, while this is not a U.S. function properly, it is part of the United Nations through the International Maritime Organization, to which the U.S. is assigned, and the Coast Guard carries forth those regulations. Within the domestic regulations, we enact the Clean Water Act in 1972, the Refuse Act of 1899, the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, the CERCLA, the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation Liability Act of 1980, which deals with hazmat, and we basically make sure that our goal is not so much litigation or punishment as to try and keep the event from happening again. So we use all this data from all these spills and all these calls and notifications we have to formulate a strategy to best focus our efforts on what parts of the river are deserve a certain amount of attention to make sure that these pollution events don't occur in the future or are minimized for the sake of public health and the environment. So the Coast Guard's primary response boundaries for the Delaware Bay really start up by Trenton. So pretty much the line across the river to the north of Trenton. They basically follow the river all the way down through Philadelphia, and they go as far, they basically cross all the bridges, all the bridge crossings. So we will go past the Walt Whitman and even past the Delaware Memorial Bridge. The final mouth of the actual Delaware is pretty much a geographic line drawn across the Cape May ferry route, which goes from Lewes, Delaware to Cape May, New Jersey. Now, the Coast Guard has jurisdictional authority beyond that, but for the most part, that's the river system which we cover. We will cover all the estuaries, tidal zones, tidal flat zones, pretty much everywhere up to and including those that actually affect the Delaware River. So it's a pretty good chunk of real estate. There is, obviously we do search and rescue on this river as well. We have a small boat station. Their boundaries are varying. We have a small boat station that will go as far down as Fortescue, New Jersey. And at Fortescue, we have a station small, which is generally a seasonal station. We also have a small boat station in Cape May, and we also have a station in Lewes, Delaware, our Indian River, essentially. Within this river system, we also have the C&D Canal, which is kind of like a shortcut to, to Baltimore's area of responsibility. That is maintained by the Army Corps of Engineers, who we also have a relationship here. The Army Corps of Engineers does the dredging projects, and they do the what's recently been the channel deepening project from 45 to 50 feet. We've been in close contact with them because they've had to shut down huge portions of the river just to keep commerce flowing. So it's been, over the last several years, we've had the equivalent of road construction essentially going on, and we've had to divert some traffic in and around that construction in a safe manner. And that's pretty much the boundaries of what we deal with. So one of the almost forgotten Coast Guard missions that we deal with, especially not just here on the Delaware River, but nationwide, is the aids to navigation folks. And basically we call them the buoy boys. They're the guys that put in the aids to navigation, marking the channels so that commercial traffic can readily use it. If you look around the buoy yard we have at Sector Delaware Bay, you'll see large quantities of green and red buoys, which have been the traditional markers for all coal regs and navigation regs in the United States since the Bureau of Navigation was formed. The Coast Guard maintains these aids to navigation through no small effort of their own. Some of these buoys weigh anywhere from a few hundred pounds to 7 or 8 tons, and all of these buoys have to be on station at all times and what we call watching properly. It means it has to be in the correct position. If there is a marine casualty or a vessel crash or an elision or a collision, not only will investigators go out and try to determine the cause of the collision, we're going to determine the safety of the vessel, and we're going to see if there's any pollution incident resulting from it. But in addition to all of that, the Coast Guard will actually take the step of sending out an aids to navigation team to physically verify that all the buoys were in the correct place at the time of the collision and that it wasn't the aids to navigation that actually caused the crash. So it's an impressive amount of work done by, and it's an impressive and hard amount of work done by a very limited amount of folks There are some stationed here at the sector, and there are some in Cape May, New Jersey. There's the Aids to Navigation team, or the ATON team. They basically run some of the day boards, solar panel, some of the inland aids to navigation, and the William Tate, which is a buoy tender class vessel stationed here at Philadelphia as well. They're the ones that will take the larger buoys in and out, and they have to make sure that those big 7-ton objects get dropped into the water within a 2-foot tolerance. And it is really something to watch from a process perspective, because they're basically dropping a giant sinker, several tons of chain, and a buoy that may weigh anywhere from 1 to 3 tons into the water, and making sure that buoy is exactly where it needs to be, because the mariners that utilize this river will generally conduct their navigation based on the location and the position of these buoys. So it's critical that these guys get this mission correctly so that no one else has to do their missions. If we keep the boats in the channel and we keep them watching properly, then they don't run aground, they don't spill oil, and they don't have incidents that we need to go respond to. This river has made America, and it's definitely helped create the United States as a country, and I don't think we owe it any less than to give it our best efforts to give back to that river and keep it clean and usable, and hand it down to the next generation of kids and future American citizens that are going to use it. The biggest spill I was ever part of on the Delaware River was the Athos 1 spill in 2004. The Athos 1 spill was a foreign ship that came in. It was single skin ship. Those have now been they've been sidetracked from the environment. They aren't even allowed anymore. But back in 2004, they were still allowed. It was she ran into an underwater submerged object at low tide, and basically peeled the hull open and let a huge amount of oil leak into the river. The total amount estimated and finalized by the Department of Justice and the EPA, as well as Natural Resource Damage Assessment, placed this spill at about 275,000 gallons. The material was a heavy fuel oil, which from a physical standpoint, it's much like a very, very sticky molasses. The spill happened in November, so it was a cold weather event. It wasn't much fun, I'll tell you that. I spent a lot of cold nights on some of these islands doing what we call shoreline cleanup assessment techniques, SCAT for short. We would basically go to some of these islands, assess how bad the pockets of oil were, and then assign contractors and coasties and environmental scientists to come and basically help with the cleanup and assist with the cleanup in those areas. The Athos spill was not a short spill. I personally was assigned to the spill for about 3 months, so it went over Christmas for us, and well into the new year of 2005. It illustrated the definite importance of coordination, and it was really amazing how much industry and the Coast Guard and all the state and local agencies, it was a little bit of a fight at first, because we're all, there's 3 states, there's 2 EPA regions here, so we're definitely a mixing bowl of multiple both social and political viewpoints. But what was nice was they were able to come together for the sake of the river, and they understood that the river drove the economy of all 3 states, so it kind of unified them in their response efforts. The spill was successful. It's still talked about as, not as a good example, but a good response example for how to respond in a very urban developed area within a port structure that's affected by a large-scale oil spill. The Coast Guard also facilitates river traffic as far as commercial needs and commercial value. We understand that these refineries and these vessels and these all these industries that utilize this river for the sake of commerce also have jobs attached to them. So if the river is impacted in a negative way, either through commercial or pollution sources, or a vessel sinks or something like that, there is potential economic damage that we have to factor in. One of the interesting things about the Delaware River is in the 1960s, this river was actually considered dead. One of the things that we use as far as determining river health is biological oxygen demand, or dissolved oxygen within the water column. Healthy rivers are anywhere from 2.5 to 6% dissolved oxygen content. In the 1960s, the Delaware River had 0% dissolved oxygen, which it's essentially like an EMT declaring someone dead because there's no heartbeat for more than 10 minutes. So for the river to have come back from 0% dissolved oxygen to what it is now, and in different parts it is higher and lower, but species are returning. There's been very successful efforts, especially with migratory birds with the John Hines National Wildlife Refuge. This river is part of the East Coast Flyway, which is basically a superhighway of birds. So when we have oil spills, it isn't necessarily just going to affect the greater Delaware Bay region. It's also going to affect migratory species who may be transiting this area. So with our partners at other agencies, with naturalists and scientists, we will do our very best to incorporate all of lessons learned and best practices and protection methods for species and areas within the river that absolutely need a serious amount of TLC care, and make sure that everyone is able to be represented in an incident command structure, which we use for disaster response all the way up to oil spills. We include those folks, and while they don't get the final vote, we make sure that their voices are heard and that their issues are taken into account before we make final decisions on how a response is done, conducted, how cleanup efforts, and the biggest thing is, much like the Hippocratic Oath, we try and do no harm. What we do as a cleanup should not be worse than the actual spill. And we try and get the environment as close to the way it was before the spill, but we understand that there are limitations with what we can do and what Mother Nature is going to have to take care of in a long-range track. But our efforts primarily are focused at prevention, but should those prevention efforts fail, we are on tap to respond to anything. We're 24/7. We get our notifications from the National Response Center, which is kind of like the 911 center for the entire country for hazardous materials and oil spills. The National Response Center takes calls from all over the country. They are vetted down to local governments and to our sector, depending on where the location was. Most people don't know the National Response Center is run by the Coast Guard, and we run it for the EPA, the Department of Energy. Anybody who calls in with a hazardous material spill, be it radiological, hazardous materials, hazardous substances, oil spills, anything like that, it goes through NRC and then it's vetted down to us, where we will respond with our state and local partners in a very combined effort. We have called our state and local partners on various spills, and they have called us for support because we each have a different amount of money, tools, talent, and technology to bring to each spill. And without our partners, we definitely would be lacking in at least one of those areas, and they have the same feeling about us. So we have great relationships with those guys. We are a federal organization, but the Coast Guard's we pride ourselves on being part of a local landscape in the same way that our small boat stations are treated very similar to like a volunteer fire department or a police department. We exist at the federal level, but we live at the local level, and that's what we try and instill with our folks who are stationed in areas. Basically, as we're stationed here, it's to give our best efforts to the area, and pretty much we live here. So for the entire time we're stationed here, we live here. So these folks aren't just our response partners, they're our neighbors, they're our friends, they're the folks we're going to maintain relationships with through the entire tour.
One of the things that I'm most passionate about and that I've been working on for now 10 to 15 years is the recovery of the tidal Delaware River, particularly the area from Camden and Philadelphia downstream to Wilmington, which has seen really horrific gross pollution over the last 100 years. There is a set of data, a set of reports published by the city of Philadelphia going back to 1912 and 1914. So over 100 years ago, showing that there was almost no oxygen in the river during summer, even back 100 years because of the gross pollution. But certainly after World War II in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, we started to understand that pollution problem more. And it is no exaggeration to say that the Delaware River, for about 20 to 30 miles, was an entirely dead river. And when I say that, it means there was no oxygen in the river. Usually that period of anoxia would start in May. And so you'd have the month of May, the month of June, the month of July, the month of August, the month of September, sometimes, usually going through October, and oftentimes even going into November and December, when there wasn't enough oxygen for any kind of normal organism, any kind of normal aerobic organism that depends on oxygen to be able to live in that river from, again, Camden and Philadelphia downstream towards Wilmington. So a total dead zone, and that prevented things like American shad. Shad might be able to sneak in the river in March and April before the dead zone set up, but then their young fish wouldn't be able to out-migrate in the fall again because they would hit that dead zone on the way back out and they would all die before they made it out to the Atlantic Ocean. And so one of the great success stories of the Delaware River is that we've taken that gross pollution, we set goals through a federal and state and local partnership back in the 1960s where they said, no, we think we can restore this. And the organization I used to work for, the Delaware River Basin Commission, played a key role in that in setting a water quality standard, setting a dissolved oxygen target of 3.5 milligrams per liter. And a lot of groups said, there's no way you can do that, it's too expensive to get up to 3.5. Other groups said, particularly fisheries groups said, 3.5 is not protective enough, right? That is not enough to allow a full nursery and propagation and reproduction to occur in that tidal Delaware River around Philly, Camden, and Wilmington. And so 3.5 is not good enough. But policymakers back then said, look, we're going to go higher than the 2 or the 3 that some industry groups were arguing for, but we're not going to go as high as some of the fishery groups are arguing for, a 4, a 5, or a 6. We're going to compromise. We're going to shoot for 3.5. We're down at 0, so getting up to 3.5 would be a huge success story. And then this was 1967, so before the Clean Water Act of 1972. But then you had the Clean Water Act, additional momentum building up, more funding, particularly funding. You also had the legal powers of the Clean Water Act. US EPA had to sue cities like Camden and Philadelphia to say, hey, no, you are going to build wastewater treatment plants, and those wastewater treatment plants are going to be in compliance with the Clean Water Act. And so that's went all the way into the 1980s. So 20 years later, those lawsuits were finally settled and those plants were built. And so from that time period of the 1960s into the 70s, you saw a little bit of improvements in dissolved oxygen, but particularly in the 80s when people got serious and actually built those plants, dissolved oxygen levels went up. 1990s, we actually saw pretty strong to very strong dissolved oxygen conditions, even above that 3.5 milligram per liter threshold. But again, in the 80s and 90s, people said that was a compromised position. That wasn't fully protective. We have had great restoration, and we're up to 3.5 milligrams per liter, and we're almost always above that 3.5 milligram per liter target set back in 1967. But in bad summers, including the summer of 2018, sometimes we get down to the 3s again, and sometimes we even fall below 3.5 milligrams per liter, either instantaneously or as a 24-hour average. And so we still have problems with DO. We still have what we call a DO sag around the Philadelphia region, particularly from Camden and Philadelphia down past the Philadelphia airport. And that DO sag is still impacting things, particularly some organisms that live in our river that are very sensitive to dissolved oxygen. What it looks like, based on a review of the scientific literature, is that our 2 species of sturgeon, short-nosed sturgeon, which spawn further upstream, actually up from Trenton, above the head of tide, up towards Lambertville, and maybe even above that, as well as Atlantic sturgeon, which appear to spawn somewhere in that Philly, Camden, Wilmington reach. We don't know exactly where they spawn, but those 2 species of sturgeon require more oxygen than any other organism that we know lives in the Delaware River. And so we know that 3.5 milligrams per liter can actually be lethal to sturgeon. And so keeping a standard of 3.5 is not protective enough to restore these 2 endangered species. And so if we want to get the recovery of the full estuary as well as sturgeon, and including sturgeon, we need to be looking at a higher standard. And what's really ironic is that going all the way back to the 1960s, they knew what it would take to get above 3.5. They said that we didn't want to invest the capital, that the step that is needed to get above 3.5 is actually just adding a conventional treatment to the wastewater treatment plants called nitrification. So they've dealt with the carbon source of microbial food that goes into the river, but they haven't dealt with a nitrogenous source of food, primarily ammonia. When you discharge ammonia into a river, that's a nutrient to some organisms, but it's actually food to a whole suite of microbes, particularly two different bacterial groups, Nitrosomonas and Nitrobacter. So you discharge ammonia into the river, and that gets gobbled up as food. Those aerobic organisms use the oxygen in the river, and that creates a DO sag. Again, Philly and Camden down to the Philadelphia airport and a little bit below that. And so going back to the 1960s, people have known that at some point in time, we're going to have to install this conventional treatment called nitrification. We're going to have to use oxygen within a wastewater treatment plant to remove that ammonia, or at least convert that ammonia to something that is not microbial food, like a nitrate molecule. So you could actually discharge as much nitrogen to the estuary, but not nitrogen as a food source, but nitrogen as a nutrient, and you would no longer have that DO sag. And so this is one of the big things that we're working on here at the Delaware River Keeper Network. We are demanding that it has been over 50 years, and we know that this is conventional treatment, and it's time for these wastewater treatment plants to step up and do the right thing. It's time for our regulatory agencies like the Delaware River Basin Commission, our states of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware to say, yeah, this is conventional treatment. There are tangible and measurable benefits to species, even species that are on the endangered species list, that will benefit from investing in that improved treatment at these wastewater treatment plants. And so it's a really big emphasis for us here. It is not the only thing that will restore the Delaware estuary, the tidal river and the tidal estuary, but it is absolutely one of the most fundamental things that we need to accomplish in the next 10 to 20 years in order to get a recovery of the river.
There's a lot of great things that are happening. People are getting more and more involved. Engineers, landscape architects, and that are becoming more specialized to treat stormwater, because stormwater is an issue not just in the Delaware River watershed, but throughout the nation, throughout the developed world. It's a huge issue where fresh water is becoming more and more of a scarce resource. And we're becoming more aware and need to protect it, and people are protecting it. Our regulations, in some regards, are getting better. There was a time when the Delaware River was so polluted down near Marcus Hook in Philadelphia from industrial waste, sewage waste. It created a blockage in dissolved oxygen where migratory fish, the American shad, which historically used to be so plentiful in the Delaware River, that there are stories where, funny stories where they were so plentiful you could walk across the river on the backs of the shad and the and other fish that down there. But because of the Industrial Revolution, all this contamination going into the river, it created a blockage. So those fish coming up in the spring to lay their eggs either had to turn around and go somewhere else or died of suffocation. There were stories where dock workers working in Philadelphia passed out because of the fumes coming off of the river. Airplane pilots coming into the local airports could smell the river at 1,000 feet above the river. And of course, the famous story out in Ohio, the Cayuga River, back in the 70s, was so polluted that it actually caught fire. The river caught fire. And that's what pushed the Clean Water Act through Congress, when everyone realized it was such a crisis that our waterways were catching fire and fish couldn't migrate through.
This time of year, which is around the middle of May into June, is horseshoe crab spawning season. It's when the crabs come out of the water to lay their eggs on the beaches of the Delaware Bay. And it happens to coincide at the same time that migratory shorebirds are coming back up from South America on their way to the Arctic to their breeding grounds. So this is really a special phenomenon that doesn't happen anywhere else in the United States, or really in the world, where we see this concentration of these really special creatures, prehistoric creatures. One of the first things we like to tell people is you don't have to be afraid of horseshoe crabs. They're not going to bite. They won't pinch. Really, horseshoe crabs are more closely related to spiders than they are to true crabs that live in the water. This one is a female. Females are about 30% larger than the males, and that's because they are egg machines. They just basically are egg factories, laying about 100,000 eggs every breeding season. So we also see kind of specialized parts that they have, and other ways that they're very similar to spiders than they are to crabs is they have specialized claws. This one here, this is a male. The male has, I'm going to put the female down for a second. The male has these specialized claws called pedipalps, which are used to hook onto the back of the female's shell to take a piggyback ride. They're not actually mating. She just needs to come out of the water to deposit those eggs in the sand, and the male needs to know where she's going. He has to follow her. So he hooks with these specialized kind of claws right here between my fingers. Those are adapted for, grabbing onto the back of her shell. In the back, behind all of the legs, we have what are called book gills, and they're like pages inside of a book. If I open up a section, they are these flaps that can extract the gases from the water in order to breathe. They use this, the tail or the telson, to help flip themselves back over. So sometimes you see them where they're stuck upside down on the beaches, and they can use that to anchor down into the sand and wiggle themselves around, maybe with the help of a wave coming by, and they're able to flip back over. The other thing we can see that's really special about horseshoe crabs are the compound eyes. They're made up of many, many parts. Another way that they're similar to spiders or to insects is they have these compound eyes. But in addition to the 2 compound eyes, they have 10, or a total of 10 eyes, but 8 other types of specialized photoreceptor kind of eyes. Really, really close, right here in the middle in the front, 2 little black dots. Those are simple eyes. They're used for, night vision, basically. Horseshoe crabs do come out during the high tide events and even during the dark of the night, and they can see very well. Interestingly, it's one of the things that scientists have studied about horseshoe crabs is finding out about their rods and cones of their eyes. They have the largest rods and cones of any creature. And we've learned a lot about human eyes just from studying horseshoe crabs. Should I keep going? There's a lot more. I mean, we could talk about the special things with horseshoe crabs is that because they're prehistoric creatures, we have found there's something really special about them. They have a blue blood, and that's because instead of hemoglobin, they have cyanin that has copper in their blood, and it turns it a blue color. But it's an amoebocyte part of their blood, kind of the white blood cells that have a compound called limulus amoebocyte lysate, or lysate for short. And lysate is what has been used in biomedical reasons in the biomedical field for testing the purity of medicine. So if you've ever been to the doctor and gotten a vaccination or a shot, you can pretty much thank the horseshoe crab for making sure that that medicine that was given to you was pure and wasn't contaminated with anything. They've been harvested for bait and for conch and eel. And in years past, they would even collect them and grind them up for fertilizer. So there has been a threat on the population of horseshoe crabs by human action, also habitat loss, where all of the development that we've done along the shoreline has affected their natural habitats. So there is concern about these prehistoric creatures. And that's going to have a major, impact directly to the shorebirds.
It's easy to forget how important the river is in everyday life. We see it, cross it, use its resources, but still we tend to neglect it. We often forget just how much we depend on the ecology of the river and all that that means. The river acts as a major artery for the area. Without it, life around it would cease. Though the river has faced years of neglect and abuses, we are entering a period of restoration, and in that there is hope that we can fix the past atrocities we once committed, as well as start a light for a bright and hopeful future.